And Russia has told the U.S. that it has no intention of invading Ukraine. This declaration came during high-stake talks in Geneva between officials from both countries. The meeting lasted for 7 hours and both sides agreed to continue efforts to reduce tensions. We have more in this report.
Like the Christmases of the Great War.
Around 100,000 Russian troops are believed to be near the border with Ukraine, prompting fears of an incursion and warnings from the West. The U.S. has said there would be sanctions if Russia were to attack Ukraine.
Our expectations are, in a reiteration of what you've heard the president say and what you've heard many officials from the United States say, which is that there are two paths for Russia to take at this point, for President Putin to take. He can take the path to diplomacy. There's 2 more rounds of talks this week. We've seen them as a package of 3, which I think they also reiterated from their side. Or there's a path of escalation. We are certainly hopeful that the path to diplomacy is the path that they will take.
Russia, meanwhile, has warned the U.S. not to underestimate the risks involved in Moscow's confrontation with the West. The two countries gave no sign that they had narrowed their differences on Ukraine and widened European security in talks that took place in Geneva, as Moscow repeated demands that Washington says it cannot accept. U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman described the talks as frank and forthright discussions designed to encourage a better understanding of each side's security concerns. This was the first chance Russia and American diplomats had to discuss face-to-face the standoff over Ukraine. And while little agreements appear to have been reached, both sides aired their concerns and set out their demands, with at least the possibility of talks continuing in the future. The Geneva talks are the first of several meetings between U.S., Allied, and Russian officials this week, which will also include a meeting at NATO headquarters in Brussels and at the Permanent Council of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which includes Russia. Monday's meeting, however, took place without the participation of U.S. European allies, including Ukraine, prompting reassurances from Ms. Sherman and other U.S. officials that Ukraine, Europe, and NATO would be included in any decisions.
No talks about Europe without Europe. No talks about Ukraine without Ukraine. And that is certainly our mentality. So we are moving forward with the other 2 rounds of talks and discussions here. But absolutely, the aggressive action, the bellicose rhetoric came from the Russians. So they have the ability and the power to de-escalate.
Russia has repeatedly denied it has any plans to launch a military operation in Ukraine. Last month, the Russian government published a series of demands, including a commitment that Ukraine would never join NATO.
And joining me live now in the studio to discuss the brewing tension in the Ukrainian border and the reaction of the United States and Western nations to it is a professor of international law, Ademola Abbas. Good to have you join us, Professor Abbas.
Thank you very much for having me.
So these talks have been described largely as high-stake talks. But both sides have come to the table with different expectations. For example, the U.S. wants to dissuade Russia from invading Ukraine. But when you also listen to Russia, their demand is that the U.S. pulls out, NATO troops should be pulled out from Eastern Europe, and that Ukraine joining NATO should be ruled out. Now, what does this idea of not coming to the table with a common agenda by both sides mean when it comes to being able to reach a mutually acceptable agreement?
Well, let's take a step back and try to understand the background to all these. Yes, trying to find a common agenda between U.S. and Russia on what is going on in Ukraine is saying you want to call a conference of cats and rats. I don't know what kind of agenda will unite them because they're working diametrically opposed in a way. Don't forget that all this dated back to when Crimea was annexed by Russia, which was in the southern part of Ukraine. That prompted some dissent from within Ukraine itself. Of course, then Russia moved in quickly and captured 2 other, territories, sort of regions in the eastern region of Ukraine, called Donbass in general. And in Donbass, you have a lot of separatists who are actually pro-Russia, who want to break out. So so since then, you've had a civil war within Ukraine. So for Russia, Donbass is a theater that they want to use to be able to effectively control Ukraine, to prevent Ukraine from going west, that is going to Europe and going to join the NATO alliance. And if you know what NATO stands for, Russia should not be expected at all to want to talk on anything that will conceptually take Ukraine off their control and put Ukraine in the North Atlantic group. It's not going to happen. Now, this is what US, of course, wants. They want a Ukraine that is pro-Europe, that is pro-West, that is also within NATO. So they cannot, on that issue, they won't have a common agenda. The question is, how do they solve the difference? Is a big question here.
And it is a lot of differences, because when you also listen to representatives from the US and Europe, they have said that these demands are non-starters. They have described them as non-starters. And Russia is really looking to expand its footprint in the former Soviet Republic, when we see the role it has played in Belarus and the role it is playing now in Kazakhstan. So if these demands are not met, could this become a pretext for more military action by Russia? Are we likely to see Russia take a more radical stance in that region?
Well, look, if you think like that, you won't be wrong at all. If you look at the antecedents of Russia, we have Crimea, we have Kazakhstan, and so many other places. So the West is not taking it, in a chilled manner, that because Russia has been saying, I'm not going to attack, I'm not going to attack. They won't take Russia's word for it. I mean, we listened to Crimea. There was no intention, then suddenly Crimea was part of Russia. Before we knew it, Crimea was annexed. So nobody trusts Russia to that extent at all. And number two is the fact that US is absolutely right. What Russia actually wants today is for NATO to go back to its 1997 border. That was before you had all the, Lithuania, all the, So basically what you want is to make sure that countries like, all the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they have nothing to do with NATO. They are not NATO member states, but they are very sympathetic towards NATO. And also, NATO is about, it's a protective force. It's a self-defense, what you call collective self-defense mechanism. So I think the tension here is what will happen if Ukraine joins NATO, which of course, at the end of the day, it is the right of all NATO member states and Ukraine to decide whether Ukraine should join NATO or not. And if that happens, what happens to the Eastern Bloc completely, which Russia doesn't want any. Don't forget in Poland, don't forget that they put in missiles in Poland, put in missiles in Lithuania, and so on and so forth. All these are causing a lot of consternation to Russia. So, I mean, for the first time, when you look at the geopolitical balancing, you will see Russia has every right and every reason to be edgy the way it is today. But the question is going military going to be the answer? The answer is absolutely no, because Ukraine, let's not forget, is not Crimea. In the days of USSR, Ukraine had the highest number of scientists in that, the nuclear scientists. Majority of the Soviet Union nuclear, they were actually Ukrainians. So Ukraine is a sophisticated military power. Has a very robust force, about 500,000, almost 500,000, strong military, and so on and so forth. So I don't think Russia is going to go gun blazing the way it went in Crimea.
And Ukraine has said they now have more ability to defend themselves, even with or without the help of US, that they have been able to grow that ability. But you said that Russia is on edge. But let's also talk about the fact that in recent times, Russia seems to be having more wins. It has been able to get the US to come back to a nuclear agreement that the US put out of in 2019. And it also now has a platform with the US to air its grievances. It seems to be a win-win for Russia in terms of these talks. But one wonders what is the need for the US, for Europe, and for Ukraine as well.
Control. Political control, geopolitics, basically. Look, the end game of all this is the U.S. making sure that Russia does not get a much stronger foothold in the Eastern Bloc than it already has. U.S. is not going to accept that because of what Russia is going to do in that particular region. We have all the antecedent there. There's no question about it. Then we begin to move towards this. I mean, we have North Korea just before now. We had North Korea. I mean, Russia is sympathetic towards North Korea. We have China. So when you put that axis together, what China is doing, what US is doing, what Russia is doing, what North Korea is doing, and all these other countries like Kazakhstan and it's not in the best interest of the West. But coming back to what Russia might do, look, I don't think Russia is going to go gun blazing because, don't forget, there are many economic carrots, or if you want, sometimes sticks that the US and the West can actually apply to Russia, which Russia is mortally afraid of today. Don't forget, Putin said to President that if they should impose serious sanction on Russia, that's going to be a fatal mistake. It could just bluff him, because at the end of the day, there is the Russia Nord Stream gas is operated in Germany. Germany has made it very clear that if Russia should attack Ukraine, they will stop that. That one is there. Latvia is threatening, for instance, to be able to take Russia off the international, financial transaction, this and that. There are so many economic, measures that could be imposed against Russia should it. I don't think Russia is going to attack, but Russia has all the aces for now. I can pressurize a lot.
It does. It does. We seem to be seeing that complaints coming from Europe about how Russia has all the aces, and it will also seem as if the US is trying to quickly get this done over and done with, just so it can then focus on the challenge coming from China.
That's right.
It does seem want to really focus its attention on China and not Russia. How do you think? Because again, when you look at these talks, you do not have representatives from Ukraine in that talk. Was that a good decision to not have Ukraine represented in that talks?
It's very curious, actually, that they were not there in Geneva. But I mean, as the press secretary just said, in the clip you played, we're hoping that they're going to be there next week. The next round of two talks that they've said. Europe is going to be there, Ukraine is going to be there. Why they were not there initially, might be a strategy to diffuse the tension, basically. You don't want to put Russia there and put Ukraine there and then get any headway, maybe to start with. That might be a strategy, but I'm hoping that going forward, those players will be able to come to the table.
High-stake talks indeed, and just a lot to watch out for. We'll see how this plays out in the coming days in terms of reaching an agreement by both sides on issues that have been put on the table. Thank you so much for talking to us, as always. Professor of International Law at Demolabas.
My pleasure.